Kazuko. I've been married to Shiro for 22 years. He is 48 years old and I am 44. Today we were invited to the wedding of Shiro's brother's son in Niigata, a city about 250 kilometers north of Tokyo. We met Shiro's parents and brothers after an absence of many years. It was a nice wedding, wasn't it?
Yes.
But I hear that the couple is moving out of their parents' home and renting a new place near their workplace.
It seems so.
Are your parents and your brother's family going to live in that big house all by themselves? Only 4 people in such a big house?
Probably.
That's a waste. Let's see. It has 8 rooms. Only 4 people in all that space? Why isn't your brother's son staying?
They said it takes a long time to commute from there. But the real reason is that maybe they don't want to.
Why not?
I guess they just don't want to live with their parents.
I don't think it's that bad living with one's parents. Local cities have become much like Tokyo. Children don't want to succeed to the family business anymore, do they?
You're right. Everybody works for companies these days.
Even in local cities?
Yes. Oh, I feel a little tired. I think I'll get some sleep before we arrive in Tokyo.
My husband Shiro was born in a village in Niigata as the 4th son of 7 children. It was 1941. Japan was in the middle of the war and only the old and women and children could be seen in the village. Young men had all been sent off to the war. However, the war ended in 1945. Soldiers began to return to their homes, increasing the population of the local area. Back then, the authority of the head of the family was still strong, and many families were made up of 3 generations. Shiro himself was from a family of 11. However, Japan enacted a new civil law under the guidance of the Allied occupational forces and relocated land ownership. Villages began to change. Above all, the land reform provided land to people who had been mostly tenant farmers. This was a great change for them. I was born in 1945, the year the war ended, in downtown Tokyo. Tokyo had been reduced to ruins that extended as far as the eye could see. At that time, food was in short supply, and rice, our staple food, was hardly to be found. The food available to common people was usually potatoes, pumpkins, and beans. We lacked other goods as well. Factories that made goods and the stores that sold them were all burnt down. The streets were full of veterans and jobless people. Nevertheless, the birth rate increased sharply from 1947 to 1949, and the period was to be called the baby boom. The Korean War broke out in 1950, 5 years after the end of the Second World War. Special procurement demands from the United States Army hit Japan. Factory after factory was built and production picked up. 5 years later, in 1955, Japan came to enjoy the biggest boom in its history. It was called the Jinmu boom. Great numbers of home electrical appliances were produced and they sold like hotcakes. Television broadcasting began in 1953. but the price of a TV set was 10 times the monthly income of an average worker. The economy of Japan continued to grow rapidly. In every factory, people were busy and there was a shortage of hands. The factories around big cities sought help from rural villages. The young people of the villages, who had just graduated from junior high schools and high schools, set out in large numbers to cities to work. It was around this time that my husband Shiro graduated from high school and landed a job at an automobile parts company, for which he still works. It was 1959, and he was 18 years old.
For someone who just graduated from a small country high school, Tokyo was really great. It was like living in a foreign country. Buildings as well as new expressways were being built everywhere I went. On holidays, we often went downtown to have fun. At night, neon lights brightened every street corner, and the beer halls were all packed.
It was the time of the Iwato boom, wasn't it?
Like everything in 1960, our factory became busy. No matter how many cars we made, they were all snapped up by eager customers. Automobile shows were held, and domestic cars became increasingly popular.
It was the time when women said, "If I'm getting married, I want to marry a man with a house and a car, but without his mother."
Oh yes, and I remember when the word moretsu shain, an employee who works like a horse, became popular. The government initiated a plan to double the average income. My own salary rose threefold over what I got when I joined the company, the year of the Tokyo Olympics.
In 1969, I met Shiro through a matchmaker. My father's boss, who acted as the matchmaker, told me the person I was to meet was a group leader at a leading auto parts manufacturer. Half a year after our first meeting, we got married. I wanted a marriage based on love, but partly because of my father's strong recommendation, I decided to marry Shiro. In those days, half the people getting married did so by arranged marriage. Our new home was an apartment house that consisted of only one room and a kitchen. When they got married, people used to move out of their parents' home, and a new household usually consisted of husband, wife, and maybe a few children. We had enough for food and clothing, but housing conditions were poor. We wanted to live in spacious government-subsidized housing and applied for it again and again, but lost in the lottery every time. Nuclear families began to appear in Japan around 1960, when the economic growth got into full swing and the number of families began to rise. The year 1969, when we got married, was near the peak of this phenomenon. Therefore, it was quite natural that we should live separately from our parents after our marriage. This was also the year when Japan's GNP reached the second highest in the free world after the United States. In all the stores, you could see goods piled high and selling well. People said, consumption is a virtue. People called it the throwaway age. They were expected to buy a lot and throw away a lot. Next year, in 1970, the International Exposition was held in Osaka. More than 64 million people gathered from all over Japan. This was a great festival commemorating the economic success of Japan. In 1971, our first son was born. The apartment house we lived in was too small. My husband's boss recommended us to live in company-subsidized housing, and we moved there. The delivery was at a hospital. Right after the birth, I returned to my parents' home for a month and learned a lot about raising a child from my mother. I couldn't help but admire my mother, for she knew everything so well. My father was delighted to see his first grandson and started buying lots of stuff for the baby. I realized that 3 generations living together is a lively and enjoyable experience from which I could learn all kinds of things. In 1973, a war broke out in the Middle East. Oil imports fell, and the impact was felt in every factory. Detergents and even toilet paper began to run short. At supermarkets, housewives competed to buy as much of those goods as they could. Up until then, we had lived without thinking much about the dependence of our country on others, but we suddenly realized that our country and economy was connected with many other countries. Our economic growth was sustained by oil. From energy such as electric power, gas and gasoline, to products such as pharmaceuticals, synthetic fibers, detergents and so on, we became aware of the many things made from oil. With the oil crisis, Japanese industry encountered a turning point. The throwaway age was over, and people were then required to conserve goods and energy. It was the following year, in 1974, that my first daughter was born. Economic growth had stopped, and eventually the economy growth turned negative. Some called it the age of the heart. In 1975, the number of people born after the war exceeded half the population of Japan. It was during this time that the baby boomers began to have families. Their attitude towards marriage was different from that of the past. They were called new families or friendly husband and wife. This marked the development of sexual equality, a product of post-war democracy. The birth rate started falling as well. On the other hand, life expectancy lengthened to become the longest in the world. The population migrated to regional areas. The corporations in the big cities began to move out to smaller cities. The age of regional development had arrived, and local industries and cultural activities flourished. As if to reflect this trend, my husband was transferred to a factory in Niigata Prefecture in 1976. Can't you say no? It might be okay for you because it's near to your hometown, but I've never lived in any place but Tokyo. And you is still a baby. Can't I stay in Tokyo with my mother?
Don't you see we are still lucky? Many of my senior colleagues were transferred when their children were in elementary schools and junior high schools. It's much more difficult to find good schools for the children these days. As long as I am on salary, I can't refuse to be transferred.
At first, I was a bit anxious about our new life in a local city. But it was a nice place. The air was cleaner, we were closer to nature, and it was quiet in Niigata. My husband's work pace was not as frantic as before either. On Sundays, we had the time to visit his parents' home. The scene of the far-reaching paddy fields with rice crops looked magnificent.
The footpaths between paddy fields, where we used to play in our childhood getting all muddy, have been paved. Farm work is all done by machines. That's why they can get it done by working only on Sundays. The kitchens have become much like those in Tokyo. Running water and gas are supplied. There are electric rice cookers, washing machines, and refrigerators. The bathrooms are all tiled.
Yes, and all the progress took place within these 16 or 17 years.
That's right.
And now your brother, his wife, and their son are all working in factories. They aren't any different from urban workers, are they?
No, not at all.
Shiro's duty at the Niigata factory lasted only 2 years. In 1980, he was transferred back to Tokyo. The following year, we purchased a house of our own, a long-sought dream. It was also out of necessity, for our children had grown up. 8 years have passed since we bought our new house. Our daughter will enter high school next year, and our son is studying hard to be admitted into a good university. Recently, sending one's children to high school is generally taken for granted. The number of college graduates is also increasing. Parents want their children to get into the best possible school, which almost automatically means a job at first-class companies. So most of the children in the neighborhood go to cram schools to study for entrance examinations. The financial burden weighs heavily on the shoulders of the parents as well. Therefore, I have been working part-time in a supermarket for 3 years. The money I make helps with the educational and living expenses, but it is also a sign that child-rearing is no longer a major subject. We've got time to do other things. The majority of part-time workers are housewives. Some work to help earn their living expenses, but I was surprised to find many were working for better living or to gain self-respect. Generally speaking, the living standard has improved and no one seems to be badly off. The problem now is when you get old. Japanese society is aging rapidly. At the beginning of the 21st century, 4 out of 10 people will be over 65.
Don't worry, we have a life insurance policy. I have also joined the corporate pension plan. And when you are over 65, you'll be covered by medical insurance.
But I really hope we won't become ill or bedridden. Most children no longer look after their parents after they get married.
Well, our son said the other day, nowadays, the number of people who want to live with their parents is increasing. I am one of them too. Little by little, the good points of family life in the old days are being reevaluated.
Our son and daughter say they will look after us. It's not really a promise, but we hope they mean it. Another thing I'm worried about is my husband's second transfer. He said that he would be transferred to the United States. Because of the trade friction, we now have to make cars abroad. So the company Shiro works for, which produces auto parts, has built a factory in the United States. The company recommends that we go together, but if we think about our children's education, we might have to let Shiro go by himself. soon we'll be arriving in Tokyo. I want to wake him up and say, "We have arrived. I hope you're not too tired." He doesn't seem to hear me, however. He's deeply asleep. It takes only 1 hour and 40 minutes from Niigata to Tokyo now. I'm sure the children are still up and waiting for our souvenirs. Tomorrow is Sunday. I am planning to make a delicious dinner and to have a happy family gathering.